Welcome and thank you for letting me join you today. I'd like to tell a story appropriate for the season. It's a kind of a Halloween story, and it's an important story to me because as I look back on it now, I realize that this story made me a storyteller. When I was 8 years old, living in Oklahoma, Tulsa, Oklahoma, in fact, my father received, this was 1950, and he received something remarkable. He was an electrical engineer who received a transfer from the Tulsa office to the Oklahoma City office, which meant that he would be taking his little family to the great new land of Oklahoma City. But I was 8, and I was in the middle of the school year, and it was decided that I would stay with my grandmother there in Tulsa and finish out the school year. My grandmother was a wonderful woman, not formally educated, but a serious reader, and someone who really told great stories. And I think you all know from being children yourselves that when you're that age, if you're lucky enough to have somebody who reads to you or tells you stories, you have certain ones that you kind of get a special fondness for, in the sense that, the last analysis, familiar stories are the best. And indeed, she had one that she told that quickly became my favorite story. Uh, it was told, I have to set the circumstance a little bit here. It was told where I stayed in her second floor apartment at dead of winter with a couple of little gas stoves glowing almost hellishly, one in the living room and one in the bedroom. And it was kind of a perfect atmosphere for a scary story. And her story went like this, and she swore it was true. When she was a young woman first married to my grandfather, they were having a lot of trouble making a retail store go. This would be at the beginning of the 20th century. And so they moved around to a lot of small towns in Oklahoma. And they were starting out a store in a place called Red Oak, Oklahoma, and they just moved there and they didn't know anybody, and they were in a little rental house. And my grandfather was down trying to set the store up, and my grandmother was at home doing wash, which in those days, of course, you hung out on the back line. Well, she was out there in the backyard, and it was a late spring day, and you could hear the cicadas, and it was sunny, a pleasant afternoon atmosphere. And as she was hanging out the clothes, she suddenly became aware of somebody standing on the edge of the yard. And she looked over, and through the summer haze, she saw, yes, a young man. In the fashion of the time, he was wearing a straw skimmer hat, and he was holding over his arm a beautiful handmade quilt. And he approached her and he introduced himself as the son of a doctor there in town. My grandmother, of course, didn't have any money. She didn't have a quarter to buy a raffle ticket. So she admired the quilt and said it was nice to meet the young man, but she said, I can't buy a raffle ticket. And he was very kind about it, and he moved off down the street with his quilt, kind of whistling to himself, and she remembers that the last time she saw him, he was kind of just dissolving into the early summer haze. Well, a few days later, she made a friend. They're in the neighborhood, and she and the friend, another woman of about her age, were having coffee. And during the course of the conversation, she happened to ask about, or say something about the young man. And the friend became interested, particularly when my grandmother said that he was the son of a doctor there in town. And then the woman just blanched. And she said, well, there was a young man, the son of a doctor here in town, who fits that description. But he died. My grandmother said, what? And she said, yes. The circumstances were strange. That doctor, although he was a very fine doctor, was known as a pretty hard guy to live with, and he was very rough on his family, to the point that one Christmas Eve a few years ago, the family had all scattered elsewhere to have their Christmas, and the doctor, a hard, tough man, was sitting alone in his study. He was looking into the open fire. He was smoking a cigar and having a glass of single malt scotch, when he became aware suddenly of something at the side of the room as well. And he looked up, and there in the side of the room stood an apparition. This is my favorite part of the story because I had no idea what an apparition was, but I loved that word with all my heart. It was just so. And as the doctor watched, according to the story, the apparition raised its bony finger and pointed at the doctor and said, "You've been a very bad man. Tonight, your son will be taken from you." And sure enough, the poor kid was walking home on the icy roads. He slipped, he went careening into a ditch, killed himself. Well, as my grandmother told it, that was the end of the story. But of course, there in the glow of the little heaters, I was just overcome. And every time I had this flurry of questions. Well, why did the young man choose my grandmother? Was he trying to raffle a quilt? What else did you find out? Everything I could bring to the table. And she would just kind of smile cryptically at me. Well, at the time I thought she was telling me a good story. Now I know she was teaching me to be a storyteller because the value of that story was in the unanswered questions. At school, on my Big Chief tablet, the next day or the day after that, I would be busily writing out a solution to this mystery or some backstory for the young man with the quilt. And I wrote my first stories about that situation right there. When my grandmother died, she died the day after John Kennedy was shot. And I remember I was in college at the time, and I remember trying to get on a bus and get to where she was because I'd been told she was in the hospital and not expected to live. And I did get there, and I held her hand as she was dying. I remember one of the last exchanges we had was, I said, "That story about the young man in the straw hat, was that true?" And although she was about to die, she replied, "Every single word." That's my story about the red-headed stranger.